Good day. Today is 4th January 2025, and we are in the run-up to the Russian Orthodox Christmas, which is celebrated on Tuesday, which is the 7th of January, by the Western calendar. Of course, by the Julian calendar, which the Russian Orthodox Church follows, it is the 25th of December. Just saying. Anyway, since we are now heading into the Christmas holiday, news from the Russian world, if I can call it that, is becoming thinner. And that, by the way, includes information from the battlefronts in Ukraine. That doesn't mean that there has been any cessation of the fighting. President Putin and Prime Minister Orban and various other people proposed that there should be a Christmas truce. I remember that back in 2022, 2023, President Putin at that time actually briefly announced a unilateral Christmas truce in the fighting in Ukraine. The Ukrainians rejected it. There's been no agreement about a Christmas truce this year. And though it's difficult, as I said, to get a clear picture of what is going on the battlefronts as of today, nonetheless, my own sense is that the fighting in Ukraine is continuing. And, well, there'll be more from me about that later in the program. Because today's program is one in which I'm going to start by discussing another conflict in another place, which is the conflict in the Middle East, and the report in Axios, American magazine, about discussions that took place last month, whatever that means, December or November. My guess is late November, in the White House, in the United States, concerning a possible attack, a joint attack on Iran by the United States and presumably Israel. Though, interestingly, Israel is barely mentioned in this Axios article. And, those who have been following this channel, those who listen and watch the programs that I've been making, I've been talking about how on many occasions, ever since the current period of crisis began in the Middle East with the attack by Hamas on Israel on 7th October 2023. Anyway, on many occasions, it has seemed to me that we have been drifting closer, very close sometimes, to a situation of conflict between the United States and Israel on the one hand, and Iran. And we've had massive deployments at various times of US forces in the Middle East. US Navy carriers have been deployed in the Middle East, sometimes to the frustration of the Pentagon, which has been asking questions about why these carriers are in the Middle East rather than in the Indo-Pacific region, and has been saying that these carriers are basically doing nothing. But anyway, carriers have been deployed to the Middle East. Amphibious warfare ships have been deployed to the seas of the Middle East. US military forces have been beefed up in various places in the Middle East. There have been reports of warnings and threats by US officials, including supposedly a letter by President Biden himself addressed to the Iranian leadership, a letter which has never been published, if it even exists, but one apparently containing all kinds of warnings, which perhaps the Iranians would have seen as threats. Anyway, those have been addressed to the Iranians as well. And there have been public statements by various Western officials, including American officials, but alarmingly also European officials, also at various times appearing to criticize Iran as the main instigator of the crisis in the Middle East. notwithstanding the fact that both US and Israeli intelligence have apparently concluded, in fact, have concluded, that Iran had no role or foreknowledge of the Hamas attack on Israel on 7th October 2023, and that in fact Iran's relationship with Hamas, especially the military leadership of Hamas based in Gaza, and the military leaders of Hamas who carried out the attack on Israel, people like Sinwar. Anyway, it looks as if the Iranians had very little contact with them. Now, one person, of course, who has been beating the drum incessantly, calling for action against Iran, has been Prime Minister Netanyahu. He began to do that in the early 2000s. He's never stopped at any point since, despite various reports from the US intelligence agencies saying that Iran basically put a stop to its nuclear weapons program following the fall of Saddam Hussein in 2003. And anyway, nonetheless, and notwithstanding, Prime Minister Netanyahu continues to demand attacks on Iran. Back in the summer, he went to the United States, he visited Congress, he gave an extremely belligerent speech demanding, appearing at least to me, to show that he was seeking some wider war in the Middle East, this even as the fighting in Gaza continued. A conflict soon after began between Israel and Hezbollah in South Lebanon. The Israelis embarked on their usual program of assassinating Hezbollah leaders, including the charismatic and long-serving Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah. Lebanon, Beirut was heavily bombed. There was extensive ground fighting in southern Lebanon, which, it must be said, however, never really achieved its purpose. Apparently, Israel was not successful in capturing even a single village in southern Lebanon. Anyway, the fighting went on, and of course there was also conflict between Israel and Iran directly. The Israelis bombed the Iranian embassy in Damascus, a series of buildings which perhaps it's worth pointing out. The jihadi fighters who have now captured Damascus have respected. They have not stormed the Iranian embassy building or the consulate, just as they've left the Russian embassy buildings and diplomatic premises in Damascus alone. But the Israelis did, on the contrary, strike the consulate building in Damascus, killing an Iranian general there. Then there was the assassination in Tehran of Haniyeh, who was the political leader of Hamas. This on the occasion of President Pezeshkian's inauguration. And there have been various other attacks on Iranian positions over and above the major war that has taken place in the Middle East between Israel and Hezbollah and other allies of Iran. And of course, the Houthis continue to launch missile strikes on Israel. In fact, they are still continuing to do so, despite Israeli airstrikes on their positions in Yemen and despite attempted attacks upon them by the United States as well. So anyway, all of this has been going on, and I've discussed at various points how all of this seemed to me to be leading towards a potential war between the United States and Iran, obviously allied with Israel. What the Israelis have on many occasions, numerous occasions, spoken about as cutting off the head of the snake. The snake, of course, being Iran. And of course, Israeli cabinet ministers have been busy saying all of the same things. Also, well, the administration began to fall apart in the summer when it became impossible any longer to pretend that President Biden was in full charge of the US government and did not have the age-related issues that everyone is now talking about, but which before it was extremely risky to talk about, just saying. Anyway, President Biden stood down. He was replaced as the Democratic Party's candidate in the November election by Kamala Harris, President Biden's vice president. She, however, was not re-elected, was not elected. So instead, it is Donald Trump who is once more president-elect of the United States. Nonetheless, and I have come increasingly to the view that many of the decisions which I suspect were set in train in the summer, perhaps in the expectation that the Democrats would retain the White House in November, many of the decisions continued to work their way through. And obviously there was missile attacks by the Iranians and the Israelis against each other's territories. I've discussed those at length. I've discussed how the second Iranian missile strike, which took place in October, actually did penetrate very effectively through Israel's air defenses and did achieve successful damage to Israel's massive Nevatim air base in the Negev desert. Anyway, so there's been all that fighting, but of course, beyond that, in November, we had the sudden collapse of Iran's major state ally in the Middle East, the Assad government in Syria. Between 27th of November and early December, the government of Syria, the government of President Bashar al-Assad, simply imploded. It collapsed without a fight. And as I've discussed in many programs, this was not the result of some great insurgency, some massive battle fought out in Syria. It was clearly the work of some kind of internal coup within Syria, with most of the top leaders of the Syrian army, the generals and people like that, the people who were in overall charge in Syria, having been basically bribed to stand down. Now, I'm not going to, in this program, revisit the whole topic of the causes of the collapse of the Assad government in Syria. I've discussed this in many previous programs. I accept that the Caesar sanctions had a role. I do believe that many of the problems arose from passive actions on the part of President Assad himself. It's becoming increasingly clear to me that his wife is very seriously ill, perhaps even mortally ill, and that undoubtedly has had an effect, causing him to lose focus on policy, on decision making. And he was perhaps never fully comfortable as president of Syria in the first place. Just saying. But anyway, I'm not going to revisit all of this. I accept that, as I said, President Assad made serious mistakes and decisions. There were the problems of the Caesar sanctions. The key point is that all of this opened the way for the mass infiltration and bribery of top senior commanders. All of this happening perhaps because the original commanders who had won the war for President Assad previously had been replaced by other men who were less reliable, either by President Assad himself or by his advisors or by through all kinds of complex processes that I'm not really very familiar with. And I've said in several programs that it's quite clear to me that this was a joint enterprise carried out by various parties, Turkey obviously playing in some respects the most important role. Israel, however, clearly also involved, and the United States involved as well. Now, in the immediate days and weeks following the collapse of the Syrian government, a series of articles appeared in the Israeli media talking about how, with the collapse of the Syrian government and of the Syrian military, and with Israel itself conducting a massive bombing campaign to destroy what was left of Syria's air defences, those air defences that had not been looted and destroyed by, as a result of the collapse, the government collapse in Syria. And with the Russians also dismantling many of the big radar sites that they had created in Syria. Anyway, articles began to appear in the Israeli media about how this opened a pathway for Israel to conduct an attack on Iran. And the point was that Syrian airspace, because of the potency of Syria's air defense system, was inaccessible to Israel, and the power of Syria's radar systems, and of course the Russian radar systems, meant that Israeli aircraft movements could be tracked, and Iran could be provided early warning of large-scale movements by Israeli aircraft, or indeed, come to that, American aircraft towards Iranian territory. Now, with Assad having fallen, with the entire air defense system in Syria having been destroyed, with Iran having lost its influence in Syria, the pathway for an attack on Iran was finally open. Iran no longer had that early warning, would no longer have that early warning of Israeli aircraft taking off from Israeli air bases. The Israelis could use Syrian airspace, bringing them significantly closer to Iran than had previously been the case. An attack on Iran had suddenly become much, much simpler. Well, I'm going to suggest, in light of this Axios article, that the collapse in Syria was at least partly intended to make such an attack on Iran possible. And I'm going to further suggest that if President Biden had been re-elected in November, or if Kamala Harris had been elected in November, following the collapse of the Assad government in Damascus in November, which clearly had been pre-prepared for a long time, had all that happened, then in that case, the Biden administration and the Israelis probably would now be moving forward with an attack on Iran. They would be taking advantage of the collapse of the Syrian government and of the collapse of Syria's air defense system in order to mount the attack on Iran. And the man who's probably the architect of all of these policies, Jake Sullivan, anyway, he has apparently continued to push to the extent that he can for an attack on Iran in the last weeks of President Biden's administration, despite the fact that President Biden is now heading a lame duck administration, and that on the 20th of January of this month, the new president of the United States will be Donald Trump. Now, all of this is to some extent, and I say it straightforwardly, my own reasoning. But bear in mind, I've been following the situation in the Middle East very closely. I've been seeing the various movements of US troops, and air assets and naval assets. I've been listening very carefully to what Prime Minister Netanyahu has been saying. I've been looking at the various actions that the Israelis have been taking. It's been clear to me that the Israelis have been trying to provoke a conflict with Iran for some time, one which they hoped would draw in the United States. The Pentagon has been nervous, or so it seems to me, about deploying its carriers too close to the Iranian coast, because it's become increasingly clear that Iran has significant and very powerful missile assets, which possibly it would be able to use against those carriers. So anyway, at some point, this is my guess. I stress again, this is a guess. It is my guess that at some point in the summer, a decision was made. Maybe the president himself was not told, but a decision was made by some people to press forward with the overthrow of the Assad government, get Erdogan and the Turks also involved in order to achieve that objective, and then jointly, after the election was out of the way, press forward with the attack on Iran. That is my guess. Now, all of that is guess. What I don't think is really disputable is that Jake Sullivan did have a meeting with President Biden in the White House, at which he and various other senior US officials discussed an attack on Iran. And we have this information from Axios. On the 2nd of January, they published this article, Scoop, Biden discussed plans to strike Iran nuclear sites if Tehran speeds towards bomb. And then we read that White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan presented President Biden with options for a potential US attack on Iran's nuclear facilities if the Iranians move towards a nuclear weapon before January 20th. In a meeting several weeks ago that remained secret until now, 3 sources with knowledge of the issue tell Axios. And then the article goes on to say a US strike on Iran's nuclear program during the lame duck period would be an enormous gamble from a president who promised he would not allow Iran to develop a nuclear weapon, but who would also risk handing a fresh conflict over to his successor. That is a colossal underestimate. Biden did not greenlight a strike during the meeting and has not done so since. And then we are told that in fact there was no actual decision made to conduct a strike on Iran. This was not really, apparently, so we're told by Axios, a planning meeting at all. It was just a discussion of hypothetical options in case intelligence came that Iran was moving purposefully towards developing a nuclear bomb before the 20th of January. This, despite the fact that elsewhere in the article, Axios tells us that there was no actual intelligence that Iran had taken any step further towards moving towards a nuclear bomb. And in fact, the article tells us that Israeli intelligence has assessed that even if Iran decided to build a bomb, it would need to develop a nuclear explosive device or warhead, and that would take at least a year to do. So there is no special or particular urgency involved. And as I said, the information in the article says that nothing particularly new about the Iranian nuclear program has actually been picked up. So was this, as Axios tells us, just a discussion of hypothetical options? Well, we are told that some of Biden's top aides have argued internally the two trends, the acceleration of Iran's nuclear program and the weakening of Iran and its proxies in their war with Israel, together give Biden an imperative and an opportunity to strike. Note the words imperative and opportunity. And we go on to read that some of Biden's allies, including Sullivan, think that the degrading of Iran's air defenses and missile capabilities, along with a significant weakening of Iran's regional proxies, would improve the odds of a successful strike and decrease the risk of Iranian retaliation and regional escalation. Now, that doesn't actually tell us that this discussion took place after the collapse of the Syrian government, but it strongly hints at it. And the article goes on to say that Sullivan suggested the blows Iran and its proxies had received over the past year could push Iran to seek a nuclear weapon. It generates choices for that adversary that can be quite dangerous, and that's something we have to remain extremely vigilant about as we go forward. And in fact, Sullivan has recently made a number of public comments about this. He has said publicly that Iranian officials have recently taken to making comments about how it might be the time for Iran to start seriously thinking about developing a nuclear bomb capability. Now that, by the way, is true. I have myself discussed this extensively in recent programs. I've pointed out that Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, appeared to float the possibility in a speech that he made some weeks ago, and other Iranian officials have spoken in favor of Iran developing a nuclear capability since then. Though President Pezeshkian and his officials, those closer to him, including Mr. Arakchi, the Iranian foreign minister, for the moment seem to be opposed. In other words, there is an internal debate about this question going on within the Iranian government. But anyway, we come back to the fact that so far there's no intelligence, apparently, that the Iranians have actually moved forward with any particular program to develop a nuclear bomb. And beyond this, it seems that the Israelis themselves are saying that even if the Iranians decided to press forward today it would take them at least a year before there is a working Iranian nuclear device. So what has happened? Was it all really just a discussion of hypotheticals? Just Sullivan coming up to the White House, meeting with Biden in the Oval Office, saying to him, well, let's just engage in a bit of, thinking here. Syria's fallen. The air defense systems in Syria are no longer functioning. Iran has taken some blows with the Israeli attacks on Iran. The Hezbollah has been weakened. Wouldn't it be a good idea, therefore, especially given that the Iranians seem to be discussing acquiring a nuclear bomb, wouldn't it be a good idea for us to conduct a strike on Iran? That's what the Axios article, in some places, suggests that this discussion was all about. Well, the answer is I don't believe that, not for one moment. I think that what we see is a last attempt by the officials of what is now the outgoing administration to implement the plan that they worked out before the November election. Before the November election, there was this build-up of tension with Iran. There were the missile strikes by Israel against Iran and by Iran against Israel. There was the assassination of Haniyeh. There was the assassination of Nasrallah. There was the fighting in southern Lebanon. The plans were put in place to overthrow the Assad government. And as I said, had Biden been re-elected in November, this meeting that took place would unequivocally have been a planning meeting, and it would have been a planning meeting to discuss the opportunity created through the collapse of Syria to move forward with a strike on Iran. The long-planned, long-prepared strike on Iran. The problem was that Biden was not re-elected, Harris wasn't elected, Trump was elected instead, and starting a new war against Iran in the last weeks, the dying weeks of a presidency that has been voted out of office really isn't a good idea. And, well, it doesn't break American law, or maybe perhaps it does, but anyway, it perhaps bends constitutional and legal principles in the United States to breaking point, even if it doesn't quite break them. But it would be an extraordinary thing to do. Surely, if anybody is going to make a decision now to start this kind of conflict against Iran, that person should be the person who, in 2 weeks' time, will be the President of the United States, who will be Donald Trump. If the administration has intelligence that Iran is actually working towards building a nuclear bomb, what they need to do is to share that intelligence with the president-elect. And in fact, we're told that such sharing of intelligence has actually happened. The article itself tells us this. Sullivan said last month that the Biden administration had briefed President-elect Trump on the intelligence picture regarding Iran's nuclear program. So this is something for the president-elect, once he becomes president, to decide and to make a decision about. It's absolutely inappropriate for Biden as president in his last weeks to start this war, a war which it looks to me as if it was carefully planned. Anyway, it makes absolutely no sense for him to start this war now. Why debate doing it? Why actually have a meeting, presumably in the Oval Office, and discuss it? Well, I think there are several reasons why this might have been done. Firstly, preempting Donald Trump's decision is also a way of putting Donald Trump in a particularly difficult position. Because if the Biden administration launches attacks on Iran at this time, attacks which of course Israel would support and would participate in, another war would be started, a conflict between the United States and Iran. Donald Trump, who has made extremely hardline statements about Iran, who clearly doesn't like the Iranian government at all, would find himself in a very difficult position. It would be very difficult for him, or so it seems to me, to simply call this war off. It might upset some of his supporters. It might upset the Israeli government, which he is known to be friendly to. It would put him in a very difficult position, and it's difficult to see how he could do anything in that kind of scenario that would turn out well for him. If he ended the war, he would be criticised. If he continued the war, he would get himself drawn into a conflict, an open-ended conflict in the Middle East, a military conflict in the Middle East, whereas previous reports have indicated that his preference is not a war with Iran, but a tightening of sanctions, a blockade, an economic blockade to try to strangle economically Iran. So that might be one reason. The extent to which the current administration maintains its hostility to Donald Trump should not be underestimated, and their desire to make life as difficult for him as possible remains and continues to be an important priority. In this, of course, it's the same as with our earlier decision, that earlier step taken in November to press forward with the missile strikes against Russia. So that's one reason. The second reason is that when a whole lot of preparation and planning has already been done, when large amounts of money presumably have been paid over to Syrian generals, when assets have been moved into place, when plans have been prepared, well, sometimes the bureaucratic pressure to see the plan through remains extremely strong. And not just the bureaucratic pressure, but the emotional pressure as well. Having invested intellectually and emotionally a huge amount of time in preparing and planning this thing, very difficult for someone like Jake Sullivan to say, well, Donald Trump won the election, let's just call the whole thing off. Of course, this assumes that my assumption that this meeting that has taken place in the White House had originally been intended to be the culminating meeting of a long series of steps and decisions, all of which worked towards a war with Iran. Well, that assumption must be true if this explanation I have just given is true as well. But there is a third reason, and it is actually a very important one, because over the next 10 days, something is going to happen, 2 weeks, something is going to happen which might start changing the entire geometry of the situation in the Middle East and might make an attack on Iran much more difficult, far more difficult than it is at the moment, and indeed ultimately more difficult than it has ever been. Because on the 17th of January, Russia and Iran are apparently going to sign and presumably move forward towards quickly ratifying a strategic partnership agreement. Now, the signature to the document will be apparently made during a visit by President Pezeshkian to Moscow, and this will happen on the 17th of January. Ratification of this agreement is expected to be completed in March. Now, I've had some information about what this strategic partnership document contains, and it's obviously come from information within Russia, and it's come from a certain source, and I'm not going to discuss the identity of this source. All I would say is that this is not difficult information to obtain in Russia. It's been extensively discussed in relatively open forums, so I'm not engaging in full speculation here. Most of this agreement is about economics and foreign policy. As is always the case when a strategic partnership is established, Iran and Russia will coordinate closely on various foreign policy positions that are mutually important to each of them. Secondly, and much more importantly, it looks as if the Russians and the Iranians, both now heavily sanctioned countries, and after Donald Trump becomes president, likely to be even more heavily sanctioned countries, at least in the case of Iran, they are going to move forward towards agreeing some kind of free trade agreement between them. This will not be the kind of conventional free trade agreement. It's more likely to be a mutual economic assistance pact. Iran will be looking to receive Russian investments. The Russians will be opening up their market to some types of Iranian goods. There will be, anyway, a significant increase in trade. And, of course, the two countries are going to move forward towards developing their banking systems, integrating their two banking systems, making it possible for Mercouris, for example, Russian Mercouris, to be used in Russia, linking up their banking messaging systems. Iran could become much more available, openly available for Russian tourists to visit, which would be an interesting development, by the way. There's an awful lot to see and do, apparently, in Iran. Certainly there are extraordinary archaeological sites and cultural sites, which I can imagine would be very interesting to people from Russia. Though, of course, there are possibly restrictions on things that Russian tourists might want to do. But anyway, I'm not going to discuss all of that further in this program. So anyway, there is going to be a major economic and political deal done between the Russians and the Iranians. But apparently, alongside the strategic partnership agreement, alongside the published part of the strategic partnership agreement that is coming, there is also a security and military dimension. Now, this is a fairly common thing. There is a strategic partnership agreement, for example, between Russia and China, as we all know. It is underpinned by all sorts of other agreements. Of this, I have absolutely no doubt. many of which touch on strategic and security and military questions, about which we are not well informed, or indeed informed at all, but which function just below the surface. And it seems as if, to a obviously lesser extent, the same will be true in terms of this strategic partnership that Iran and Russia are going to be working towards. Now, it should be clear, and the information that I'm getting is that what is being discussed falls well short of an outright military alliance. Russia is not committing itself to come to the defense of Iran if Iran is attacked. But Russia will provide Iran with significant military assistance. So the Russians will take steps to develop Iran's air defenses. In fact, it's been suggested to me that the Russians and the Iranians are going to work towards fully integrating Iran's patchy air defense system into Russia's far more comprehensive and detailed one, and effective one. And in the war in Ukraine, we've seen how effective and comprehensive Russia's air defense system is. So we'll get, no doubt, more supplies of advanced Russian missiles, more Russian radars located in Iran, but all of these will no doubt be connected to Russia through fiber optic networks, and of course the Iranians will be provided with early warning from Russian satellites and drones and long-range radars based inside Russia and in some other neighbouring countries aligned to Russia. Altogether, the Iranian air defense situation is going to be transformed. And it's likely that this will also work towards strengthening Iran's air force. Apparently, Iran has now received the two first Sukhoi 35 fighter jets. It's already received deliveries of Yak 130 ground attack and trainer aircraft. And anyway, there will be a significant long-term upgrade of Iran's military system. And once all of these steps have been put in train, and this is obviously a process that could take years, but once this has all been done, I'm going to make my own suggestion, which is that at that point, an attack on Iran will become far too risky for the US Air Force to seriously entertain. And that will probably affect Israeli planning as well. Now, the Russians apparently have made it quite clear that they're not going to provide any assistance to Iran's nuclear program. And in fact, they clearly do not want Iran to move forward with its nuclear weapons program. It could be that all of those statements made by those Iranian officials a couple of weeks ago were partly intended to put pressure on the Russians and to try to get the Russians to make more agreements extending Russian military assistance to Iran than the Russians had perhaps initially wanted to do. So that might have been part of a game. Who knows? I'm not going to speculate about this. But anyway, it looks as if the Russians have said Iran should not develop nuclear weapons. Iranian officials, notably Foreign Minister Arakchi, have come back and have again been saying today, in advance of this meeting, this summit meeting between Putin and Pezeshkian in Moscow, that Iran will not be moving forward with a nuclear weapons program. As we've seen, that is a Russian insistence. The Russians are insisting on this as part of the enacting of this agreement. And in that respect, by the way, this agreement is a stabilizing factor in the Middle East, because the Iranians may say to themselves, in fact quite plausibly will say to themselves, that if they get this kind of air defense shield through the help of the Russians, then they will not need nuclear weapons anymore. And that could significantly lessen some of the uncertainties and pressures that might exist currently in the Middle East. As I said, if the possibility of an American and Israeli strike on Iran is conclusively taken off the agenda, and if the possibility of Iran moving forward to developing nuclear weapons is also removed, then, as I said, that could be a stabilizing element in the diplomacy in the Middle East. Anyway, that's the agreement that apparently is coming, that the Russians and the Iranians are going to sign on the 17th of January. Now, that might explain why people like Sullivan, some of the hardliners in Israel, some of the other neocons in the United States want an attack on Iran now, because they're worried that once this agreement is signed, once it is ratified, once the Russians and the Iranians move towards its implementation, then the time window for a strike on Iran will start to close. And quite plausibly, given that the Russians do not want to be in an alliance, an outright alliance with Iran, it could also be the case that people like Sullivan and the other neocon officials in Washington, and possibly Prime Minister Netanyahu as well in Israel, are saying to themselves that, look, let's attack Iran now before this agreement is made. Not only will that warn the Russians against moving forward with that agreement, it's quite likely to make the entire agreement impossible, because the Russians will be very reluctant to move forward with a partnership agreement with Iran if Iran is at war with Israel and with the United States, and that will kill the possibility of this agreement, which could place Iran once and for all out of our reach. That could kill this agreement completely. So I can see why, despite the fact that Donald Trump won the November elections, despite the fact that there is no sign that Iran is going to be able to develop a nuclear bomb by the 20th of January, indeed the whole idea that it can is absurd, despite the fact that there's no evidence that the Iranians are even moving forward at the moment purposefully to develop a nuclear bomb, and despite the fact that any decision of this kind really should be made by the next president of the United States, who in just over 2 weeks' time will be Donald Trump. I can see why some people in Washington might want to start a conflict with Iran now. Cause as much trouble for Donald Trump as possible. Strike at Iran whilst you still can. Use the opportunity that has now been presented to cut off the head of the snake, and crucially, do so before this partnership agreement between Russia and Iran is signed. If you unpack it, and if you apply neocon logic to this whole situation, then the decision to launch an attack on Iran in the dying weeks of President Biden's administration does not look so surprising. Well, I'm going to repeat again. I think that doing this would be an absolutely terrible thing to do. First of all, it would be a terrible mistake in terms of Iran's nuclear program, which presumably, which would overtly be the reason why this attack was happening, to prevent Iran moving forward with its nuclear program. Now, there's lots of stories about how Iran has embedded its nuclear facilities deep inside mountainsides and deep caves and things of that kind. There may be technologies that can break into these caves and caverns and underground bunkers and things of that kind. My own view, however, is that whatever the Israelis and the Americans do, if the United States wants to guarantee that Iran will develop a nuclear bomb, then the way to do it is by attacking Iran. I say that on the assumption that the Iranian government survives the pressure, which, by the way, I think it would. I think an American attack, an Israeli attack on Iran, would consolidate Iranian society around the current government. And that government, finding itself at war with two nuclear powers, Israel and the United States, would then have an overwhelming incentive to press forward with nuclear weapons acquisition. It has the scientific and technological knowledge how to do that. It also has the raw materials in the form of enriched uranium. Even if all of the equipment could be destroyed, even if the enriched uranium could be hit and dispersed, which would create all kinds of further contamination risks, or so I assume. Even if all that were the case, I still think Iran would be able eventually to acquire a nuclear bomb. After all, it is not without friends who already have nuclear bombs. North Korea, Pakistan, possibly places like that. I still believe that in time, perhaps quite soon, Iran would acquire a nuclear bomb. And of course, even if the Russians do not want to be allies of Iran, and nor do the Chinese, they don't want to defend Iran in the case of it being attacked. If it is the subject of an unprovoked attack of this kind, I suspect that the Russians, who after all want to divert the United States away from Europe and from the conflict in Ukraine, would have an incentive in providing Iran with technologies and means in order for it to defend itself. So the United States could find itself in another very, very long war. And one that could cause all sorts of further problems in the Middle East as well. So, I think this is a terrible idea. For the moment at least, it looks as if it has been called off. I suspect that the Pentagon has once again put its foot down and said no. But the fact that a discussion like this has taken place in the White House at all, that Biden and Sullivan even discussed the idea of a strike in Iran, that Sullivan even put up hypothetical options to do it, that Donald Trump was not apparently included in these discussions. If he was, I would assume that the Axios article would mention the fact. If all of this was the case, well, it tells us a huge amount about the administration that is now currently leaving office. It seems to me that what Garland Nixon said about it right at the time when it was first formed, that this was an extremely dangerous administration. Well, here you see the further proof. Now, anyway, that's what I'm going to say about this article in Axios up to now. We still have, of course, more than 2 weeks to go before the inauguration of Donald Trump. We still have just under 2 weeks before Pezeshkian and Putin sign the partnership agreement. It's still possible that it could happen. My guess is that this article in Axios was rushed out by someone who wanted to prevent it. Let's keep our fingers crossed and hope that it doesn't take place. Now, let's now turn to that other war, the war in Ukraine. As I said, we've had less news at the moment about what has been going on the battlefronts, but there is still some news, and it continues to focus mostly in the areas around Kurachovo and Pokrovsk. And it looks as if the Russians are indeed in a strong position, increasingly strong position around Pokrovsk, that they have indeed captured the village of Peshanye, and they are indeed, as has been claimed, now on the outskirts of Kotlinye, the village Kotlino, the village I discussed yesterday, and that they're attacking also the village of Uspenivka. So all of these various places to the southwest of Pokrovsk are indeed being captured by the Russian military. Meanwhile, we've been told by TASS that after the fall of Vozvyzhenka, the Russian army is now very close to cutting the main supply road between Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka. Russian troops, this is from TASS, have intensified shelling pressure on the highway leading from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka. The security forces have told TASS. The Pokrovsk-Konstantinovka highway is under heavy shelling. The pressure on it is increasing due to our successes on the front line, including in the area of the village of Vozvyzhenka. Only a little more than 2 kilometers remain before the road is completely under our control. So the Russians are very close now to cutting the road from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka. Before long, they will have also started to cut the supply routes leading to Pokrovsk from the north. So the encirclement of Pokrovsk is accelerating. Elsewhere in this area, there continues to be this rapid Russian advance against almost no opposition west of Selidovo. And there are reports now that the Russians have not only captured the village of Shevchenko, which lies to the west of Selidovo, and to the west, by the way, of the Kurachovo reservoir, But interestingly, that they have now occupied the territory, or are about to occupy the territory, of the biggest lithium deposit in Ukraine. Now, there's been a lot of talk about Ukraine being a source for minerals, mineral wealth, that there's apparently lithium and all kinds of other, well, in fact, it's well known that Ukraine is very, very rich in strategic minerals. And it's been claimed by various people, including Senator Lindsey Graham in the United States, that this is one of the reasons why the United States and the Western powers need to keep supporting Ukraine. And in fact, it's even been suggested that this was the entire reason behind the entire conflict, to get control of Ukraine's abundance of natural resources, including the key lithium deposits. Well, if that's the plan, the biggest one, is now either under Russian control or about to fall under Russian control. So the Russians continuing to push forward in this area as well. Indications that the last remaining defense line in this area, defense position in this area that the Ukrainians have, the Orakli, Andreevka, Rozliv, Constantinople defense area, that is in the process of being encircled as well, opening the way for a Russian advance to the Dnieper. There's also more reports of further Russian advances in Toretsk. It looks as if Ukrainian control in Toretsk is now very limited, and that the Russians apparently have enlarged their bridgeheads west of the Oskol and Zherebets rivers. And there's also a report that the Russians have begun, or rather resumed their offensive towards Sudzha from the east, that they are once more attacking Svedlikovo, the important village in Kursk region, which lies northeast of the main supply road to Sudzha from Sumy region. And it is in Sumy region, by the way, that the Russians have also conducted another big missile strike. So the whole situation on the front lines in Ukraine continues as bad as ever. There's much speculation that the Ukrainians are planning some kind of counterattack, either towards the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant or perhaps in Bryansk. It's been suggested that the mobilization of 18-year-olds and 18 to 25-year-olds is going to free up more trained troops from the Ukrainian army to mount some kind of offensive in 2 months' time. The Military Summary Channel has correctly pointed out that whenever Ukraine has conducted a mobilization in the past, it has immediately followed up with an offensive. It carried out a huge mobilization in the spring and summer of 2022, and the result was the offensives in Kharkiv and Kherson region in the autumn of 2022. Then it conducted a further, more limited mobilization, apparently, in the winter and spring of 2023, with some troops being trained in Western Europe, and that then led to the summer 2023 offensive. And then, of course, in the spring of last year, in the spring of 2024, Ukraine reduced the conscription age from 27 to 25. More men were called up, and, well, a few months later, the Kursk offensive was launched. So it would be completely in character for Zelensky and Syrskyi to misuse any extra soldiers that they get as a result of this disastrous conscription to launch another offensive. Some people are suggesting Bryansk region, as I said, in Russia, as being a likely target. Well, who is to say? If there is such an offensive by the Ukrainians, it will further accelerate the already inevitable collapse. That, at least, is my view. So, anyway, that is the military situation in Ukraine. For the moment, no further news about much in the way of diplomatic activity, but I am going to offer my own guess. There's been a series of articles, including one recently in the London Times, about how the Ukrainians are trying to reach out to Trump, how they're trying to persuade him to see things from their point of view. The Europeans apparently are doing the same thing. I'm coming increasingly to the view that these articles, which have been appearing all over the media, in Europe at least, that Trump is being won round to the theory that the Russians need to be forced to the negotiating table by further sanctions pressure, by more military supplies to Ukraine, by, in other words, an escalation of the war by the United States, an escalation in order to de-escalate, one could say. That all of these articles ultimately have one source, and that source is Kiev. I think that the Ukrainians have been engaged in a major campaign over the last few weeks, talking to their friends in Europe, to their friends in the media, to their friends in the United States, to sway the Trump administration, the forthcoming Trump administration, in that direction. And yes, they have had meetings with some Trump officials, including Vice President-to-be, J.D. Vance. But the ultimate decision maker remains Donald Trump. I think he perfectly well understands what is going on, and he's not going to make any decisions himself until he's met with Putin. That is my own view. I think that he understands, and understands very well, that meeting with the Russians is the logical and proper way forward if a negotiation process is to be conducted effectively. Now, Ian Proud, the former British diplomat, has written a very interesting article on both on responsible statecraft and on his own blog at Substack, suggesting 6 points that the Trump administration needs to keep in mind in order to avoid failure in the forthcoming negotiations. And I have to say, I think that this is actually a good article, and it does point to some serious things. Firstly, he says that right now there is no strategy. And he's absolutely right. I have discussed this in many places. Failure in Ukraine has emerged out of, this is from Ian Proud, out of Western disunity as the US, the EU and the UK and intra-alliance interests collided on key issues such as sanctions, war aims, financial and military support. The run-up to the presidential elections and its aftermath saw repeated appeals to Trump-proof US policy towards Ukraine. Kellogg should encourage Ukrainian and European leaders to coalesce around a single realistic vision for Ukraine's future. Defeating Russia is not a legitimate foreign policy goal, as Ukraine will never be in a position to deliver this. The focus might include rebuilding a strong, democratic and prosperous Ukraine that attains EU membership at a determinate time. So I completely agree that there is not any plan, as long as it takes, is not a plan. Assuming that Ukraine can outlast Russia, or that the West can outlast Russia, is not a plan. I believe that there was originally a plan. The plan was to cripple Russia through sanctions, to provoke an economic crisis there, to force the Putin government to collapse, to force its collapse, to achieve regime change in Russia. And that was the plan that existed in the first couple of weeks of the conflict, when it became increasingly clear that it would not work, and when it also appeared in April that sticking with that plan might actually cause Ukraine to begin serious negotiations with the Russians, leading to the Istanbul Agreement. That was when the United States and the Western powers switched gears and embarked on a major program of military support for Ukraine, which has certainly succeeded in prolonging the war, but only as a result of provoking an even deeper military crisis, not just in Ukraine, but ultimately affecting the whole of Europe. So I think that there was a plan, but I think that the plan has failed, and that the problem is that there's never been a coherent way to come up with a new plan, given the grandiose and extreme nature of the original objectives. So I agree that a more realistic thinking is needed. Whether EU membership forms a part of it is another matter. But anyway, Ian Proud goes on to say that one cannot strike a deal without talking to Putin, which is absolutely true. I think Trump understands that. The next is Ukraine is never going to join NATO. Well, that's true, but the Russians will have to be convinced that if Trump promises it, it will never happen. And that might be very difficult to achieve, just saying, going forward. And then Ian Proud says that the Europeans should stop kicking the can down the road for EU membership and move forward with EU membership. I personally am starting to think that as far as the Russians are concerned, the door on that is closing. But anyway, you can read what Ian Proud has to say about that. And that sanctions haven't worked, but can help deliver peace. And here actually Ian Proud makes some actually valuable points, which is that though the sanctions themselves are unsuccessful, the best thing to do would be to start easing on them in the first few months, perhaps not doing away with them entirely, but starting to ease some of the sanctions in order to create goodwill in advance of the negotiations. And I think that is a much, much better approach than the alternative one, which is being talked about now, which is to escalate sanctions instead. Escalating sanctions is going to make the Russians less willing to negotiate, or at least to consider proposals. Easing the sanctions is going to put them in a more amenable mood, and in a mood where they're more likely to take Trump and what he comes up with seriously. And the last point that Ian Proud makes was one which I completely agree with. Zelensky may be a problem, not the solution. Well, as far as I'm concerned, he absolutely is. So anyway, we will see what happens. But my own view is that it's probably premature to expect any real movements from the Trump administration until the meeting between Donald Trump and Putin has taken place. And realistically, even if work is done as soon as Trump is inaugurated in January, it's going to take several weeks to set up that meeting. And, well, a date in March is perhaps the earliest one can realistically expect. But anyway, that's my view on the in today's program. Tomorrow, I propose to return again to the gas issue, which is getting extremely ugly. And I think there's a dawning realization that, in fact, cutting off the gas from Russia might not have been such a clever idea after all. But anyway, we'll say more about that. I'm going to discuss the situation in Transnistria. And, well, quite plausibly, we'll be having more, we will have an awful lot more, no doubt, to say about the situation in Ukraine. Returning to the subject of today's program, I think we have had a very, very near miss. I am sure that if the current administration had been re-elected, if Joe Biden had been re-elected in November, or if Kamala Harris had been elected in November, this meeting that took place in the White House would have been a fully serious planning meeting. And over the course of the next few weeks, perhaps even now, we would be in a war with Iran. As it is, the election in November has prevented that from happening. Hopefully, we will avoid such a war. There's still, as I said, 2.5 weeks of this administration to go, but hopefully we will avoid such a war, though a lot will depend, again, on what Donald Trump does. That's the end of my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out to check out our shop. Links under this video. If you've liked this program, please tick the like button and check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.